This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
A question for you listeners. How do you define your diet or describe the way that you eat? A friend asked me this recently, and it got me thinking about my relationship with animal foods and how often I choose to eat meat and dairy. I'm by no means vegetarian or vegan, but the word omnivore doesn't seem to fit either. I dine out quite regularly, and I can't help but notice the growth of plant-based eating, whether that's the amount of plant-based products in supermarkets or new vegan options on menus. It's a movement that has been causing waves through the food industry, creating lots of debate, and whether this is conscious or not, it's prompting a lot of us to figure out where we sit on that diet spectrum. I'm Leyla Kazim, and in today's programme, I want to find out more about the social and cultural changes that have come about from this recent explosion of interest in plant-based eating. My first call was to the writer, campaigner and food policy expert, Rob Percival. Rob, hello.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So it seems that the plant-based diet is gaining in popularity. And what I'm trying to understand is what effect this has had on the food world, our eating culture, how we define our diets. How would you sum up the cultural shift on this whole topic in the past decade or so?
It's a confusing picture, I think. There are two sort of phases that you can discern across the past decade. There's this period leading up to 2019, 2020, when veganism was growing in popularity, plant-based was becoming trendier, and that all sort of peaked around that time. And then a huge period of disruption ever since, with COVID, with disrupted food prices, the sort of pushback from the meat lobby, a sort of counter move against the plant-based movement. And now we're in this sort of churning, it feels like to me, this churning cultural shift in which some of these trends are yet to really level out. So it's quite hard to predict, I think, how it's going to play out in the next few years.
And it feels like people, they understand what veganism means and they understand what vegetarianism means. And then you've got this other term, plant-based, which kind of feels like a more flexible concept. How do you understand the definition of that term?
Yeah, I think it's a really important distinction. I mean, to start with veganism, I recognise that to be a principled stand against eating or using animals, typically an ethical concern, a strong environmental concern. And I think you can differentiate the growth of the vegan movement from the explosive plant-based hype that grew alongside it, peaking around 2020 and spilling over to today. And the term plant-based, I think, can either mean a diet with no animal foods in it or a diet with reduced animal foods. There's some ambiguity. We have all these plant-based products coming on the market, a real sort of explosion of that segment of the market, which we're now seeing a bit of a contraction as well. But again, those products are aimed at flexitarians, at meat eaters, as much as they are at vegans, strictly speaking. So a really mixed picture in terms of where does your identity lie if you're identifying as plant-based? Is that rooted in ethics? Is that rooted in health? Is that rooted in the environment? And I think that people answer that question in very different ways.
And then you've got the term plant-focused.
Plant-forward, plant-rich.
Yes.
Yeah, there's dozens of these terms, yeah.
The plant-focused way of eating, I mean, that reflects so many dietary patterns of so many cultures going back for a long time. Why do you think it's now that this movement has gathered so much momentum?
There's something to do with the rising consciousness around the climate and nature crises, and there is a good body of evidence saying that definitively our diets do need to change. Affluent Western countries need to be consuming less meat. And then there was this real eruption of social media interest and celebrity interest in plant-based eating about 5-10 years ago, which suddenly made it pretty cool to be going plant-based. I think just a growing awareness that the status quo isn't viable in the future and that actually there are other options. But certainly it feels like the sands are shifting beneath us.
And what do you think the overall impact of veganuary has had since that started?
I think the campaign has effectively brought into the mainstream the idea that plant-based diets can be normal, enjoyable and fun. It's maybe been a victim of its own success. Certainly in the UK, sign-ups have sort of leveled off over the past few years. It's still growing globally. In a sense, it's probably contributed to the normalisation of meat reduction, flexitarianism as it's called, to the degree where people now think it's quite normal to reduce meat consumption, but maybe aren't as motivated to go fully plant-based because there's that middle ground which has emerged. But it certainly had a significant impact.
In 2012, two passionate activists, Jane Land and Matthew Glover, met and came up with an idea which would become Veganuary, the charitable campaign which invites people to do a meat and dairy-free month at the beginning of the year. This January marked a decade since it launched, and starting with about 3,000 sign-ups in the first year, it has grown into an international campaign, reporting approximately 25 million people globally participating in Veganuary in 2024, according to research in partnership with YouGov. I wanted to hear their story, so I had a chat with Jane and Matt to find out how the idea evolved.
We met on a dating site. I was on a vegetarian dating site, and then you were on vegan dating.
Oh gosh, I didn't even know they existed.
No.
All weird sort of things on the internet.
Yeah, it was like one of the deep, dark areas of the internet where there's vegan dating going on. I didn't realise when we first started talking that she was only a vegetarian. But nevertheless, we went on a date. The rest is history, I guess.
I was sort of vegan curious, wasn't I, when I met you? And so you really guided me through it, and you say it's a lot easier than you think.
How were the seeds of this idea of Veganuary planted?
There was Stoptober, there was Dry January. So we were like, could we do a vegan month? January just seemed like the perfect month when we thought it through, you know, with New Year's resolutions, with people more focused on health and well-being.
Wanting to make ethical changes as well.
When we launched in that first year, the media really took it on board. And at the same time, some supermarkets started to show an interest. Ocado put our logo on their website without even asking us. At the time, it was a hobby. You know, the profits that we're making from our business interests was funding this. So it was all pretty much for the first 2 or 3 years, it was self-funded. Yeah, and then we started building it year after year and getting people involved, and it's really grown up and become an adult organisation.
Right at the beginning, what were your main hopes for Veganuary?
We always launched it as an individual diet change pledge that we wanted to encourage people to try vegan. It evolved much more than we expected in the corporate space. And I think we very quickly realised that there was going to be interest from retailers and restaurants. And that's absolutely was organic, wasn't it? And something that we didn't predict on that first year.
They very much came to us. You know, they started coming to us for advice. We were pushing against a real open door. We felt that's the biggest thing. The impact that we've had is how the corporate world has engaged with us and embraced it. I think we're very proud of that that's what ultimately happened. One thing I would say as well is that a lot of the vegan campaigns before Veganuary, they came across as being judgmental, or it's an all or nothing scenario. It was go vegan, do it now, forever.
Or otherwise you're an awful person.
Yeah.
And Veganuary wasn't about that.
No, we wanted, although deep down that's what we want people to do, but, you know, our strategy was much kinder, much friendlier. It was just saying, look, give it a go for a month. If in February you go back to your previous diet, that's absolutely fine with us.
So how would you say the rise of the plant-based movement has affected veganism and the vegan community?
It's a contentious question, and I think there's a divide in the vegan movement, isn't there? Some would be like, veganism is a lifestyle, it's not a diet. It can maybe set a confusing message. I think we're probably more on the other side of things, where it's that if it wasn't for these people eating this way, then we wouldn't be seeing the change that we are in society. We wouldn't be seeing the change in the corporate world.
It's what strategies are going to help us reduce the suffering of animals to the greatest degree. We're on the pragmatic side. We're open-minded to different theories of change, and we felt that we've got to meet people where they are. It's about moving society as fast as we can, but ultimately gradually in the right direction.
Jane Land and Matthew Glover on how the Veganuary campaign became one of the catalysts for more of us dabbling with the plant-based way of eating. and its inclusive nature is very much mirrored in the place I'm going to next. It is lunchtime, and I'm starting to see some plates from your restaurant come out. I think we need to try some of your food.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Muriel Armitage is a chef and founder of Club Mexicana, a vibrant vegan restaurant which has moved from supper club to street food vendor to having 3 branches across London over the last decade. We met over some of her amazing jackfruit short rib tacos to talk about how the perception of plant-based and vegan restaurants has changed in that time.
The reason that I started Club Mexicana was I came back from travelling different countries, Australia, America, Mexico, loads of vegan options everywhere. I came back to London and there was very little, and what there was a sort of very ethics-based, small-scale cafes that had a very hardcore vegan audience. What I wanted to do with Club Mexicana was change the perception of vegan food, look more interesting, be like bright, vibrant, tasty, and also allow people to eat vegan food without any sort of judgment or ethics being forced on them. I just wanted it to be about the food and the ingredients. And I think the changes that we've seen in that time have been like monumental, really, from the size of the audience to the dishes that have been created, the number of vegan dishes that are now on non-vegan restaurants' menus. And I think just the interest in it has soared.
How do you describe the menu here, vegan or plant-based? Because you've used those 2 words kind of interchangeably.
We've always used vegan for Club Mexicana. It says what we do on the tin, and I think plant-based is a bit softer and also maybe doesn't have to adhere to the rules as strictly as vegan.
Interesting, because I think a lot of people associate the word vegan with an identity.
Sure.
And so even if someone might like to mostly eat plants, they don't identify as a vegan, whereas plant-based maybe to people is more of your type of diet.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I think vegan is a bit of an identity thing. The key thing for us, actually, is about making everything look amazing, taste amazing, rather than, and I think this was the problem with where vegan food or plant-based food was previously, in that it was labelled before anyone had even got a chance to try it. And like you said, if that's seen as an identity that people don't prescribe to, then that immediately puts people off. So that's kind of what we've tried to do, is like break down those preconceptions and those barriers that stop people from coming in.
So what I'd like to know is the customers you get here.
Quite a high proportion of our customers are not vegan. Now, you don't have to be a vegan to like plant-based food. The number of people that I talk to every time I tell them what I do, they're so quick to tell me how they have changed their eating habits and they now eat plant-based like 3 or 4 times a week. From day one of trying to recreate sort of Mexican meaty classics, but in a vegan way. For us, that's not about buying in some vegan chicken. We make everything from scratch. We don't use any processed food. You know, it's about creating things that have a sense of familiarity to them. And some of our best and most loyal customers are like the hardiest meat eaters. But I think that they like new things. They like loads of different flavours going off in their mouths. And that's why they come in and they keep coming back.
Muriel Armitage of Club Mexicana. But are we really becoming as plant-based and flexitarian as we think? Last year, media headlines about stagnant or falling sales of plant-based products prompted questions of the so-called vegan bubble bursting, but also pointed out that challenges such as the cost of living crisis and an overcrowded market could be contributing to that too. To make sense of all the latest data on the number of people following a flexitarian diet, it's over to Harry Wallop, consumer journalist specialising in what supermarkets sell and what we put into our shopping baskets.
So the data is unbelievably confusing. A lot of it relies on surveys commissioned often by very interested parties. So a lot of the data is conflicting because a lot of people say that they may be vegan or they may be flexitarian. Are they really? So that the best data is what goes into people's shopping baskets. And a lot of the supermarkets do know what we are buying. So the rise of flexitarianism is real. And we know this because people in the same shopping basket are putting in vegan cheese or vegan sausages alongside some mince or some chicken breasts. People are experimenting, they're broadening out what sort of things they eat. The most reliable data for me is the incredibly detailed Family Food Survey, which the government has run every year since the 1940s, and it measures volume rather than value. And in very simple terms, this government survey of 5,000 families shows we are eating less meat. We're eating actually quite substantially less meat year on year, and we have been for the last decade. It's just been a real change, particularly red meat, eating far less beef. Chicken, less so. Chicken's pretty flat. Cheese is holding up incredibly well. In fact, we eat more cheese now than we ate 10, certainly more than we ate 20 years ago. We think that certainly in the UK that vegans, committed vegans, make up 2% at most of the population. So YouGov, they've been running this since at least 2019. So in 2019, 13% of people said that they adopted a flexitarian diet. In 2022, it did go up to 16%. Back in 2024, a few weeks ago, down back to 13%, basically old habits.
So how have supermarkets responded to this growth of the plant-based trend in terms of what they're offering their customers?
So the supermarkets, initially, they saw all the search data and they just started offering vast amounts of vegan versions. But they're pretty ruthless. If it doesn't sell enough and it's taking up valuable shelf space, then the other thing's going to go back in. So there's been a slight reversal. We've seen a bit of a backlash. So Heck, quite a big sausage maker, cut the amount of vegan versions quite dramatically last year. And they admitted that they got overexcited by the search data and what people said that they were eating rather than actually what they were putting in their baskets.
So do you think this kind of shift in sales figures signals a levelling off of an interest in this way of eating? Or is it just sort of part of a natural ebb and flow of how a market might gradually become established?
I think it's exactly that. I think people are still very interested in cutting back on their meat, partly to save money, but, to help the environment, to help their health. The real kind of slogan of ultra-processed food movement, or rather the anti-UPF movement is, I think it's a terribly simplistic message, but if it's not an ingredient in your kitchen store cupboard, you shouldn't really be eating it. And I think that's one of the key reasons why even though meat eating is falling, and I think it'll continue to fall, it's at the same time, vegan products are not doing very well.
Consumer journalist Harry Wallop. Well, the cultural effect of all of this is now something that's being studied more and more by academics. At the University of Sheffield, food geographer Dr. Alex Sexton recently published a paper examining the mainstreaming of veganism, including the impact of the corporate nature of the trend and it becoming so influential in the online and social media world.
Some other tensions that have come from the trends of vegan mainstreaming have been to splinter vegan identity and practices along different sort of identity markers. So you've seen the rise of, for example, health veganism or environmental veganism alongside the perhaps more historic identity marker of ethical veganism. What the rise of health veganism versus environmental veganism has allowed particularly corporate brands to really capitalise on certain products fitting and delivering those different aspects. Whereas some people see that as a net positive in terms of encouraging people to reduce the amount of animals that they're using in their daily practices. Others are worried that it's diluting the ethical and radical potential of the practice and of the identity of veganism. Whilst there are clearly massive shifts going on in the sort of practices of veganism, but also those kind of cultural and economic politics as well, it is still in many ways small in relation to the global livestock industry. And importantly, whilst you have these vegan trends seemingly on the rise, is it actually displacing and replacing the use of animals, or is it just adding to the overall sort of production and consumption systems that we already have?
In capturing and analysing the cultural, political and economic shifts around the vegan and plant-based trends, one of the hopes of this research is to contribute to constructive conversations across the food industry on the future of our food and what values we want it to be based on.
Another outcome of this siloing effect of veganism into these singular motivations has been this general oversimplification of the narratives around what the products can deliver. This has started to create concern and debate around whether some of the products that are being launched under those kind of vegan and plant-based labels might not actually be as healthful as certain animal-based products, or particularly more whole food versions of vegan and plant-based items, so legumes, pulses, etc. These higher processed products are what have driven big food and big agriculture for decades. And so these are the systems, these are the supply chains, the commodity markets that are already in existence. Big food has seen veganism as a new market opportunity to essentially pivot their existing systems into a new customer base. It's asking that bigger question of what we want the future of food to look like and who do we want it to involve.
Dr. Alex Sexton from the University of Sheffield. And it's not just the vegan world that's been ruffled by the growth of the plant-based trend. It's challenged cultural narratives around eating meat and prompted us to question our values and ethics on what we eat. During my conversation with Rob Percival, whose recent book, The Meat Paradox, picks apart our complicated relationship with eating animals, we discussed why the act of choosing to reduce or remove meat and dairy from our diets, or not, has become such a polarising topic.
I think for generations we've taken it for granted that eating animals is normal, natural and necessary. And there's a whole sort of cultural narrative that's been woven around that, where we say, if we give them a good life and a quick death, then basically it's fine. And we're realising now in the context of the climate crisis that quite radical change might be needed to our diets. And the growth of the vegan movement has posed a real challenge to those three ends, the idea that it is normal, natural and necessary to eat meat. And given that consumption, the way that we eat, is so deeply tied to identity, this has caused a fair amount of strife across society. And that's what we're seeing in the binary picture that's emerged with farmers and carnivores on one side and vegans and animal activists on the other, a real splitting of the waters. And what we have to do is find a way through all that to a new dietary norm, a new, more sustainable future in which actually we do relate to animals in quite a different way and actually feed ourselves in quite a different way.
How do you think farmers and the food industry have been reacting to the increased interest in cutting down animal product consumption?
We've seen from within the farming industry not just a lot of tension, a lot of concern around this, but there's been a sort of coordinated counter lobby to try and persuade people that actually meat is healthy, it can be environmentally benign and so on. There's a campaign that runs every January now called Eat Balanced, run by the industry, which talks up the nutritional benefits of red meat and dairy. It became quite sort of, again, binary and pugilistic almost. We have now very distinct and contradictory narratives that are played out across the media, across society. On the one hand saying that, don't worry, if you buy British, it's all good, just keep eating meat and dairy. The other saying, actually, no, the best or only solution is plant-based. And so people are confronted with quite a confusing environment in which they're now trying to make dietary choices.
And then how would you describe the politics of this and the evolution of this sort of culture war between farmers and then parts of the vegan community, say?
So I think actually there is a big pragmatic middle ground. There's a growing body of farmers who recognise that they need to change the way they farm, respond to the climate and nature crises. There's a big segment of the plant-based and vegan community who recognise that farmers themselves aren't the enemy. It's the sort of system that surrounds us all that needs to be shifted. But I think the politics are hugely challenging because farmers at the moment are facing significant financial pressures, economic pressures. Just staying in business is the priority. The sort of more progressive trails of thought around how do we need to farm in response to the climate crisis, how do we need to evolve into the future, are at risk of being buried under the more immediate sort of financial concerns. So the decisions that governments make in the next few years are going to be hugely consequential in terms of what food and farming in the UK looks like in the decade ahead.
Rob Percival. When I scroll through my social media, I often see the meat eating versus vegan debates playing out, especially in the comments sections. And it can seem that some of the loudest voices are pushing more of a black or white, all or nothing approach. It can be hard to see where the middle ground conversation can emerge, but it does exist. Back at Club Mexicana, I was joined by Leyla Norms, a YouTuber and podcaster who's been really honest about trying and failing every day on her journey towards cutting out meat and dairy completely.
Hi, I'm Lena. I talk a lot on the internet about positive panic, including everybody in the climate conversation, because I don't think we're going to get anywhere if we don't even start talking about it. And it's awkward and it feels shameful and it's a little bit itchy, but it can also be a proper laugh and a lot of fun. And I think that's where the sparkle happens, and that's how we're going to get anywhere with any of this.
So how do you identify the way that you eat?
Do you know what? I actually watched a YouTube video by someone called Catherine Klein last week, and it's actually made me think, at the moment I'm like an aspiring vegan or a flexitarian. She made a video about how actually identifying as a bad vegan is quite an interesting point of view, because instead of it being about your behavior and how good you are at something and whether you're 100% pure, it's more about your ethical values. So I would say that I'm a bad vegan in that I 100% am on board with all of the research and all of the information I've read. I'm convinced. I am just not enacting that in all of my life right now, and I'm doing it very gradually to make sure that it's permanent.
So you are accepting that it's more of a journey to actually get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting on for about 85-90% of my life. I've been eating meat and dairy with wild abandon. Loving it, evangelical about it almost. Very exciting. One of the pivotal moments for me was reading a book called We Are the Wet Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. He talks about in this book the struggle with actually secretly eating meat for comfort in moments of distress or grief or loss. So it's a beautiful book about shame, losing people and culture and how emotional food can be, but also how emotional the future could be if we don't start changing things together, and how we think about tradition and history as something fixed, but we can actually participate in tradition and change it, and that is actually part of honouring tradition, is evolving it and changing it. So that was part of it. I slowly, in 2020, made the resolution to become vegetarian.
But you aspire to be vegan?
Yes.
How is that going?
It's actually going okay. So I started doing a thing this January called Half-Assed Veganuary, and I gave people 10 different options of things they could do, whether that's being a tag vegan, which is where you share a vegan diet with a friend. If you don't think you can commit to a whole vegan diet all the time, why not create a vegan diet between two people? The planet doesn't mind.
Oh, like
it's the same impact.
Like when people have job shares.
Yeah, it's like a job share. So you text your friend and be like, oh, really, I'm going to this amazing burger place tonight. Like, could you do me a solid and eat a vegan meal? Oh my God. And they'd be like, yeah, sure. Do you know what I mean? Or if somebody's like, oh, I actually cannot physically live without my yogurt in the morning, the other person's like, no worries, I like oat milk on bran flakes. And that kind of idea of it being a shared thing instead of an individualistic, puritanical thing, I think could get us a long way. So that's one of the suggestions. Everybody has such a complicated relationship with food. I don't know anybody who doesn't have some kind of weird feelings about it. Rather than it being like, oh my God, I can't believe I failed because I ate some cream cheese, I just think, how many of these can I win? It really depends on what's helpful for you, but I don't think that's for everybody, and that's okay.
Leyla Norms and her approach to embracing some of the difficulties and nuances on her journey towards going 100% plant-based. And if you have a story to share on changing your diet in whatever way, we would love to hear from you. Email us at thefoodprogram@bbc.co.uk.